Okay, good. Well, today is April 19th, 2025, and the LaRouche Organization is celebrating the 250th anniversary of the beginning of our fight for independence, the first anti-colonial struggle of its kind in the world. 250 years after the shot heard around the world, the British are still colonizers. We're going to open with a musical offering from that time period.
Let tyrants shake their iron rod, and slavery clang her galling chains. We fear them not, we trust in God, New England's God forever reigns. What grateful offering shall we bring? What shall we render to the Lord? Loud hallelujahs let us sing, and praise his name on every chord.
Good. So to take the title of today's event, 250 years after the shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord, the British are still colonizers. Now, there are few ideas that I think are more clear in the public understanding of LaRouche than the fact that he was always attacking the British Empire. They make fun of him for this. They say LaRouche thinks the British Empire still exists. LaRouche says the Queen of England is pushing drugs. He's crazy. The British Empire is over. It isn't. Just a few thoughts about what's occurring today, and then we'll take a look at our nation's history. Think of the conflict in Ukraine. It began in its current form in February 2022. It began before that, of course. In April, Boris Johnson played the leading role in killing the opportunity to reach an early peace agreement to end that conflict. The British have cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, the destruction of billions and billions of dollars of land, equipment, the waste of military expense. That's the British for you. Look back a little bit earlier to the disaster of the Iraq War in 2003, where Bush said Saddam Hussein, who was developing weapons of mass destruction that could threaten the region, perhaps the globe. He was even making a nuclear weapon. This is what we were told. What was the leading source of the intelligence supposedly showing a smoking gun that Iraq was pursuing nuclear weapons? British intelligence. Consider the Russiagate hoax against Trump, both against Trump and against the United States, by creating animosity with Russia. Where did the Russiagate intelligence come from initially? Think about Christopher Steele. Think about British. Britain has been characterized as having no permanent allies, only permanent interests. Among those interests are a control over global finance. They insist that a new economic system not come into being. It's expressed itself in control over trade and through their intellectual control by making people believe things about economy, about history, that prevent them from moving forward. Consider Adam Smith. Some people say Adam Smith is the basis of the United States. We're a free country. We're not communists, we're free. Adam Smith, capitalism. Adam Smith was British. He did not have America's interests at heart. And as we'll learn today and over other events that we're pursuing here at the LaRouche Organization, the American system of economics is in opposition not to communism, which is recent, but the British system, the British Empire. So let's turn now to our first speaker, coming to us from Boston, from the area where the first battles of the Revolution took place, Dennis Speed. You're muted, Dennis.
Okay, how about now? How are we now? I'm good? Can you hear me?
You're good.
Okay, great. Well, there's a lot that we'll be covering, but we are here for the purpose of reviving the outlook that was contained in this book, How the Nation Was Won, by the person, revolutionary that wrote it, H. Graham Lowry. Graham Lowry, at one point, was in charge of our work in Boston. He was a professor. He had been recruited in New Jersey, I believe, at Rutgers. And he proceeded to write a book which is completely unique in the annals of American historiography. It tells a story that nobody tells in any way other than Graham. It's important because the actual story of the actual American Revolution and how it actually occurred. He started it in 1630 and carried it in this volume through 1754. But it's illustrative of the purpose of today and what we're talking about today. Now, actually, today, we started yesterday, last night, at as a symposium that was conducted by Diane and Chris and Anton Chaikin, another historian and a longtime member of this association, who has been working on a series of books titled Who We Are. That's probably the most revolutionary proposal to make today in America, because in an America of identity politics, no one knows themselves, let alone the country. People talk about identity all the time as the least of what they're interested in. There is an American identity, and that identity is a revolutionary identity. That's one of the reasons that people don't know it. That they advocated that. They don't have an interest in the general welfare of humanity as a whole. And you cannot be an American and not start from the premise of the general interest of humanity as a whole. You have nothing to do with the American experiment unless you start from the premise of the general interest of humanity as a whole. Now, that was the key element of what Graham established in his book. What we're going to do today, because there are many different persons presenting, so I just want to give a sort of an indication of why it's so important that we think this way. 4 years ago, Vladimir Putin gave a speech, and he was speaking to a group of social workers in Russia. And he said the following: the very values of mercy, love for one's neighbor, and support for those in need bind and consolidate the entire centuries-old history of our people. They constitute the spiritual basis of the traditional religions of Russia. The fundamental aim of life should be to do good. Now, at the time that this was stated, some of us recognized that he was referring, though from a Russian standpoint, referring to the very ideas which were the core ideas that motivated the young Benjamin Franklin, as he described it, who had been educated by the Mather family, Cotton and Increase Mather. And he wrote about this, he referenced this in his book. Actually, he wrote a letter to Cotton's son, Samuel. And he said to him, Samuel Mather, this was later on, Ben Franklin was about 78 years old when he wrote the letter, 1784. He said, I remember well both your father and grandfather, having heard them both in the pulpit and seen them in their houses. And he says that the Essays to Do Good, which is the book written by Mather, perhaps gave me a turn of thinking that had an influence on some of the principal future events of my life. He says, this is all Franklin is writing to Samuel, that the book had an influence on my conduct through life, for I have always set a greater value on the character of a doer of good than on any other kind of reputation. And if I have been, as you seem to think, a useful citizen, The public owes the advantage of it to that book. And then there's a list here of some of the various ways in which Benjamin Franklin talked about the organization of his secret society, which is called the Junto, on the premise of Mather's Essays to Do Good. This is something that Franklin adopted when he was 18 years old in 1724. What happened was that and this is the way that he described it at that time, there seems to me at present to be great occasion for raising a united party for virtue by forming the virtuous and good men of all nations into a regular body to be governed by suitable good and wise rules, which good and wise men may probably be more unanimous in their obedience to than common people are to common laws. I at present think that whoever attempts this and is well qualified cannot fail of pleasing God and of meeting with success. So he began the process of organizing this society to promote, as he said, the improvement of so many more young citizens by the use of our institutions, our better acquaintance with the general sentiments of the population, and the increase of our influence in public affairs and our doing of public good by spreading through the several clubs the sentiments of the Junto. This was a project that was a secret project, but what it did was it asked, what was it that was needed by the society? And when you talk about, for example, the very thing we're in was founded by Benjamin Franklin. Public library did not exist. Public universities were founded by Benjamin Franklin. Fire departments were founded by Benjamin Franklin. Public sanitation was founded by Benjamin Franklin. Public roads were founded by Benjamin Franklin and his junto. They were all organized. Those things all came out of a conspiracy to just improve things for humanity. Because, as you can tell by present day America, you literally have to conspire to just get people to act the way the human being should act now. That's what's happening to us. That's the level at which we have sunk. We sunk. This happened before in American history, happened before in Massachusetts, and it was talked about by the Mathers, that from 1630, when they had the Revolutionary Society that they had, until 1690, they did all right, but they degenerated, and then a new American Revolution had to be created. That's why Benjamin Franklin was sent to Philadelphia out of Boston, because Boston had lost at that point its revolutionary fervor, and the option had to be taken to move to Philadelphia and then restart things then. Now, of course, Boston came back, as we know, and this is the 250th birthday of that time at Lexington and Concord when the actual battle was engaged. Now, in order for us to abbreviate and get to everyone, let me simply say something about the idea of conspiracy. And for this, we have a little bit of a slide thing. I think we got it now. Great. The first of these, it should be Erasmus of Rotterdam. We're not going to say a lot about Erasmus except the following. Erasmus, born in 1466, I believe, died in 1536, is sort of the founding father of this organization. In the 1970s, if you had been around and you've been talking to Lyndon LaRouche, she would have told you that this organization was an Erasmian conspiracy and that it was organized around the idea of promulgating knowledge everywhere possible in the world. That's what Erasmus had done. He set up a series of universities coming sort of out of the tradition, which will be talked about by Chris Sayre and probably also maybe Bob Western may had a chance to touch on it, the Brotherhood of the Common Life. But this is something I just wanted to indicate him next. As Ben Franklin, that's whom we've been talking about, and Franklin is the arch conspirator that created the basis for what became the American Revolution, starting in 1724. So by the time you got to 1776, he'd been doing this for 50 years, 52 years. It's important to understand that this was the best prepared revolution in history. Next. This is a shot of Benjamin West, who's there on the far right. And I'll say something about him. Benjamin West is from Springfield, Pennsylvania, excuse me. Actually, his house is now on the site of what is now Swarthmore College. He was a self-taught painter. He was sent to Italy and then to England to study. And he created what was called the American School of Painting in London. On the right there is Matthew Pratt, who later would found the Pratt Institute, or be one of the inspirations for the founding of the Pratt Institute. But I wanted to say something about some of the people who were the students of Benjamin West, who, by the way, spent the entire American Revolution, even before that, I think from the 1760s, all in England. And if you ask, and if you look up in history, say, well, he's a very ambivalent figure because he was clearly very close to the King of England, but he had all these people who were students, who were Americans, who he taught, and these people were generals and military officers in the American Revolution. How'd that work? And by the way, he taught them in London. Okay, next. This is a picture of Charles Wilson Peale. Peale is the founder of the Philadelphia Museum. I mean, he's an American soldier. He fights at Trenton. He's on the retreat. He's part of the Pennsylvania militia. And he's the one that does the first pictures of Washington that people get to know worldwide. He and John Trumbull both. But so that's who he is. His dates are 1738 to 1820. Next. Okay, that is John Trumbull. Now, John Trumbull's from Connecticut. He's an interesting person. If you look on the back of the $2 bill, you'll see his painting of the Declaration of Independence. And if you go to the rotunda in Washington, there are 4 of his paintings there. Now, he sketched the plans of the British and American lines at for the Battle of Boston. He's born in 1756, so he's 20 years old when he's doing that. He was part of the Battle of Bunker Hill. He became an aide-de-camp to Washington. He resigned from the army in 1777, and then he went to London and became a painter there. And Benjamin West suggested, maybe you should do miniature portraits of various people from the American Revolution. Well, while he was there, he also painted a picture of Washington, and it became very well known. But he was almost hanged in London at the time that Major Andre was hanged here. They were looking for other people to hang as a sort of reciprocally in London. They arrested him, charged him for treason, put him in the jail for a while, but he got out after about 7 months. What he did then was he went back to America. And what's relevant here is that he, in 1784, after the end of the American Revolution, paints a picture which Graham would have loved, which was, and this was again at the advice of West, the deputation from the Senate, the Roman Senate, presenting to Cincinnatus the command of the Roman armies. Now, those of us who understand what the Society of Cincinnatus is, realize what it is that Trumbull was doing with that painting, because that is the secret society, or the intelligence agency, which is the legacy of the American Revolution, in which the Marquis de Lafayette and also Edgar Poe, the poet, and others were contained. Next. That's Rembrandt Peale. That's one of his sons. He had 4 sons. One was called Rubens, one was Titian, and forget the other one. I'm just coming to, but and there's Rembrandt. So they were all painters. That makes sense. Okay. And I just put him in because both he and his father did portraits of Lafayette. We'll see those in a minute. Next. That is the portrait that was done of Lafayette, which is by Rembrandt Peale. Next. That's the portrait of Lafayette, which was done by actually Charles Wilson Peale. Yeah, that's actually a different portrait, but you get. But he did it at that point. Next. That's it. That's all you have. Okay. Well, there's another portrait which was done by Samuel Morse, but we'll leave that out. That one is the one. No, that's all right. It's okay. We don't need it. Because the last person I wanted to mention that was one of the people the West trained was Samuel Morse. Now, Samuel Morse and James Fenimore Cooper. Samuel Morse goes to Paris in 1832. And he paints a very famous portrait then, which is in the Louvre. And basically what he's doing is he's painting all of the paintings he can find in the Louvre to bring them back to the United States to put them on display. But the other thing that he does while he's there, together with Fenimore Cooper, is he invents the telegraph, or he begins the work that invents the telegraph. He's not the only person working on it. He's working with people in Paris to do that. Important element here is to understand that in and with these people from the American Revolution, science and art were one discipline. And of course, Franklin is their originator. The important point I want to just draw here, just as a kind of concluding idea, is that the idea of literacy and the idea of action, these things were the same. The movement that Lyndon LaRouche created, which is a movement of literacy and action, is a descendant of this. The idea when we talk about this, that we're not right wing, left wing, up, down, center, it's not that. It's that there was one great action that happened in humanity's history, greater than any other. It was the revolution from the period between 1776 and 83, yes, and then from 83 to 89, yes. But it came from a conception of doing good. And that is the way in which you change history. You must have the conception of doing good. That is what the American Revolution is, nothing more, nothing less.
So thank you, Dennis, for that. We are turning to our next speaker here, Jose Vega, I'd say long time, but you're not very old, LaRouche activist, interventionist. There we go. Yeah, come on up. Yeah, you're up.
All right. I want to thank everybody for coming out today in person, or if you're watching on the live stream, and thank you, Dennis, for your presentation. Before I begin, I want to start by saying that I was 16 years old, I think, when I came. I think it was to a Schiller Institute conference or concert. It was either that or it was a town hall. And I remember Dennis Speed opened up by saying, people often call us conspiracy theorists. And I think he said something along the lines of, that's insulting, but not for the reasons that people think it is. Because we don't just theorize about conspiracies, we are conspiracy practitioners. So, that was one of the things that kind of hooked me into this, because to be called a conspiracy, first of all, if you're proud to call yourself a conspiracy theorist, there are many people that I know on the internet who are like, I figured out the grand conspiracy behind it all. I figured out how Israel pulls the strings or how the British pull the strings. I know it all. That's great. Now what? What good is it to know what you think you know if you're not going to actually put into practice the solutions to solving these things? So I get insulted by being called a conspiracy theorist, because then that means I'm doing something wrong. I should be practicing my conspiracies. And I semi-recently learned that the word conspiracy just means conspire together or breathe together. So if you've ever sung in a chorus, congratulations, you are a conspiracy practitioner. So you should applaud yourselves. But my conspiracy today, what does it mean to elect yourself in the context of the birthday of our country, the 250th birthday of our country? We were supposedly founded as a democracy, right? But authority belongs to those who are willing to actually fight for principle, not for those who are elected into office. It's ideas that move culture and societies forward, not votes. You may think that's ironic. Isn't it my job as someone who wants to call themselves an elected official to be as appealing as possible to get the votes needed to get into office? But the truth is, any politician who gets elected by appealing to the lowest common denominator will only ever be just that, the lowest common denominator. Obama, if you will. How many people in the United States even know the name Gouverneur Morris? I often get told that I must be mispronouncing the word governor. And sorry, do you mean Kathy Hochul? Or I know Mario Cuomo. How many people in the United States know the words of the preamble beyond just "we the people"? The whole quote, the whole preamble is, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." See, the first words in the Constitution are saying the people are the ones who are ordaining and establishing this Constitution for not just themselves, but for our posterity. When this was first written, we were the posterity they were talking about. And now all of your children's 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 children ad infinitum are our posterity. The future is our posterity. This means that when you read these words out loud, it's like you're declaring the words as if they were written down for the first time. To put it slightly differently, the entire preamble is a subjunctive idea that will always be true whenever it is said and declared out loud with intention. And it's not a coincidence that the same man who wrote these words was a staunch anti-slavery advocate. And I mean staunchly, not just him, but both him and Alexander Hamilton had fierce fights about this at the Constitutional Convention. When this idea of the 3/5 clause came up, he had said this. I'll read you a very short quote. He said, "Slavery is," that's what I added just for the context, "in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages." So there's this sort of notion and belief that all of our founding fathers just kind of said, we'll talk about slavery later. That is not true. So when you look at the preamble, when you look at the Constitution and even the Declaration of Independence from that standpoint, knowing that there were founding fathers who hated the idea of slavery, who were completely opposed to it, but they knew that they weren't going to win that fight. Obviously, they didn't. It wouldn't be until the Emancipation Proclamation that that fight would finally be over. It wouldn't be until the Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery that that would actually be over. Yet, why did they frame the Constitution with those words in the preamble? Why was the Declaration of Independence written the way it was? Because it was always an anti-slavery document. This is a point that Dennis Speed makes often on his Saturday town hall shows. And if you know that, and if you knew that before the Civil War, if you were someone like Frederick Douglass, who was completely opposed to what John Brown was doing, and who had faith that Lincoln knew the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as anti-slavery documents, see, that was the power. That was authority. That's what got Frederick Douglass to recruit 100,000 Black men to the Union. That belief that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are anti-slavery documents. Now, Gouverneur Morris was also a Federalist. He was a strong proponent of a national government. Him and Hamilton both believed in the presidency. And he hated, abhorred the idea of a parliamentary system. I'm sure some of you may have seen this quote recently of the UK criticizing the United States, talking about Trump and saying, this is why the United States should have a parliamentary system. Well, Gouverneur Morris had actually preempted this. He said, if the people should elect, they will never fail to prefer some man of distinguished character. Please forgive the last few presidents, though. Of distinguished character or services, some man, if he might so speak, of continental reputation. If the legislature elect, It will be the work of intrigue, of cabal, and of faction. It will be the election of a pope by a conclave of cardinals. Real merit will rarely be the title to the appointment. Can you think about that right now if the Congress, the way it's composed right now, was choosing who the next president would be? What's the best you get? Cory Booker? Nancy Pelosi? Chuck Schumer? So, we should all count our blessings that as flawed as our fellow neighbors and citizens may be right now, that we should be thankful that they are not like the people in Congress. Because the people in Congress are the lowest common denominators, not the citizens. But I digress. Gouverneur Morris is from the Bronx. And what I've talked to you about so far is something that the Bronx is. It is not whatever you preconceived notion you have of the Bronx. It's not that. Gouverneur Morris is from the Bronx. Edgar Poe is from the Bronx. Out of the Bronx comes a tradition of creating and upholding principles of real justice, a balance of power, and a real power of the people that is rooted in the ideas of the Constitution, not just anger or rage, but a vision for a prosperous future for all. And it's funny, because when you go to Gouverneur Morris's gravesite today, it looks disheveled. It's right in St. Anne's, 138th Street and St. Anne's Avenue. And this historic, beautiful church, and it's not just Gouverneur Morris buried there, his family is buried there. And it looks disheveled. It doesn't look like it's been maintained in a while. And the immediate surrounding neighborhood looks like crap. That entire region, which what is known as the South Bronx, is the anchor that makes that congressional district the poorest congressional district in the entire country. And it would probably be even worse if it didn't have Riverdale to it. But the way we maintain the neighborhood where Gouverneur Morris is, the man who wrote the preamble to the Constitution, the man who wrote the words, "We the people." Why does his neighborhood look like that? Now, we can blame the politicians. Believe me, I have. I'm known for yelling at them. I'm known for going after them. But the fault is really the citizenry. Because our responsibility is the most important one. When our politicians fail and our presidents fail, we are the first and last line of defense. And we've allowed the Bronx and the whole country to become the mess it is now. But there's an opportunity. 250 years of a tradition of justice, of fighting against oligarchism, fighting against imperialism. Are you ready to decide your future right now as an anti-slavery, pro-development country? Because if you are, you're in the right place. And that is your declaration of independence. That is how you will declare your independence. You will declare your independence by declaring your independence. It's not just something you do once, it's something you have to do every day. And that's what it means to elect yourself. That's how the Bronx has to elect itself. That's how everyone in this room has to elect itself. That's how the world has to elect itself. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, Jose. Our next speaker is TLO's Vice President, Chris Sayre.
Can I be heard? Great. Sounds like I can. Okay. So I've been working on straight into the microphone. Okay. All right. Great. I have been working on a project, and this I've done this a presentation a couple of times. I'm adding to it. So this will hopefully have some fresh material in it for people who have seen the last two presentations. But nonetheless, I don't think that this could be stressed enough, because this is really the fundamental issue of history that Lyndon LaRouche gave us as a gift, as people who love history. And I really recommend everybody here to take up history, because that's how we got here. I mean, if you don't know your history, you don't know how we got here. And as Tony Chaikin has said, who we are. And I thought the discussion last night was really exciting. So I want to go to I was glad that Dennis used a lot of artistry in his presentation, because there's going to be a theme in this as well. And you're going to see that the whole idea that I'm presenting here is that the United States literally came out of the golden Renaissance of Europe. And this is a painting from Raphael that you see the entire painting, the School of Athens here. And here is a detail of that, with Plato pointing up to the heavens, and he's holding his book, the Timaeus, and Aristotle basically being held back from walking forward by his book, Nicomachean Ethics. So we're going to go here, and we can see what Aristotle says. What's his view of mankind here? This is on the subject of slavery, which I would just assert, slavery is not just a thing in the United States history, right? This horrible thing, slavery. Slavery is your view of humanity. Slavery is your view of a human being. I mean, later on, LaRouche made a big point of attacking the human use of human beings. It was a book written in the 60s, which he attacked. So this is what Aristotle says on the human use of human beings. It is not only necessary, but useful, and from the hour of their birth, some are marked out for those purposes and others for the other, and there are many species of both sorts. So it is natural within the male and the female. The one is superior, the other inferior. The one governs, the other is governed, and the same rule must necessarily hold good with respect to all mankind. Those men, therefore, who are as much inferior to others as the body is to the soul, are to be thus disposed of, as the proper use of them is their bodies, in which their excellence consists. And if what I have said be true, they are slaves by nature, and it is advantageous to them to be always under government, under slavery. He then is by nature formed a slave who is qualified to become the chattel of another person, and on that account is so, and who has just reason enough to know that there is such a faculty without being endued with the use of it. For other animals have no perception of reason, but are entirely guided by appetite, and indeed they are very, very little in their, they vary very little in their use from each other. For the advantage which we receive both from slaves and tame animals arises from their bodily strength administering to our necessities. For it is the intention of nature to make the bodies of slaves and freemen different, blah, blah, blah. So I'll just go to the end here. Since then, some men are slaves by nature and others are freemen, it is clear that where slavery is advantageous to anyone, then it is just to make him a slave. And that's the law of Aristotle. That's the law to infinity. There can be no, I mean, this is how Aristotle is. There's no questioning. There is my declarations as law. Now, let me just go back real quickly to the question of, as I pointed out the other day, I don't have any quotes from Plato, but I will just point out in the Meno dialogue, Plato makes the point of bringing in a slave boy to double the square. That what he proves in this dialogue is that a slave boy who has no training, who is destined to be a slave supposedly, has the mind and mental capability like anybody else around him on the planet to figure out this geometric problem. So so I'm going to go to the 100 Years' War Edward III, Plantagenet of England, launches a bloody war in France. And you can see the picture on the far right, he's counting the bodies of the dead. And this, along with the Venetian bank house failure of the Bardi and Peruzzi bank houses, leads to the Black Death, the bubonic plague, the absolute insanity of burning Jews alive because they claimed that Jews were the cause of the Black Death, and a complete insane, non-scientific outlook. Flagellants, if you flagellate yourself, then you can become free from this plague, supposedly. So you can see the situation in Europe in the 1300s is not pretty. It is not a renaissance. And in some places like France, half the population dies during this period. Pulling out of that dark age, you have a movement, and this is a painting by Vasari, and you're going to see some paintings by Vasari throughout. He's a Renaissance painter, and he paints here a picture of 6 poets from Florence, but Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch here in the center. And their whole polemic is to revive Platonic thought over Aristotelian thought as a way of pulling Europe out of this dark age. And they write poems, like long poems, like the Divine Comedy, in the vernacular, in Italian, to educate the average person in Italy with a beautiful language, to uplift the culture with a beautiful language. Or in the case of Petrarca, who developed the sonnet, which later on we know Shakespeare writes 154 beautiful sonnets, and Petrarch developed the sonnet. In the Netherlands, you have Geert Groot forming the Brotherhood of the Common Life and the Sisters of the Common Life. He formed the Sisters of the Common Life out of his house, where he brought in 7 or so young, poor girls and trained them in classical Platonic Christian philosophy, and then forms the Brotherhood of the Common Life. And you can see all of the different schools that are created, monasteries, convents, brotherhoods, houses, and schools. And the whole idea that Groot has is that knowledge is for everybody, that everybody is capable of learning, poor, rich alike, male, female. Women are not inferior to men. Men are not the ones who are going to govern over women, as Aristotle says. But everybody is able to be educated, and that's going to be the basis of forming a advanced society. Now, take this young lady here, Joan of Arc, an amazing person. And in the class I gave last week, I went through a lot more detail, but I'm going to skip some of the details here. But I would just point out that Joan of Arc comes out of those circles of the Sisters of the Common Life. And she, faced with the fact that the British have essentially conquered northern France and are about to take Orleans. If they take Orleans, that is it for France. France will be run by the British. The nation of France could very well be over at that point. She mobilizes Charles VII to fight the British in a way that the French hadn't fought for 100 years. And she's able to make a victory in Orleans, a 4-day battle, very, very bloody battle. She's wounded, but victorious. And it's her spirit that mobilizes the French forces to fight the British in this way. And she continues up to Reims. And the story is that along the way, because of this incredible victory in Orleans, basically there are no more battles on the way to Reims, that the gates of these towns open up and she is welcomed in. This is northern England occupied, and then you have Burgundy down here, which is they're allied with the British. in their destruction of France. So Charles VII is then formally coronated in Reims. Gerson, excuse me. He is French. It is true. So he, very, very important. He defends Joan of Arc against charges of witchcraft. He defends the Brotherhood of the Common Life from charges that they're heretics because they believe that people outside of the cloth can be educated with the Brotherhood of the Common Life. And he designs the educational system for Louis XI, an educational program for Louis XI based on Plato, based on St. Augustine, a Platonic Christian father from the belly of the Roman Empire in like 350 AD, who's a Platonist and who essentially defeats the Roman Empire with his outlook. So this is how Gerson is now, but she is betrayed, she's captured, and she's betrayed, and she's put on trial and charged with heresy, and she is burned at the stake under the hands of the British and the French, who are controlled by the British still at that point. Nicholas of Cusa, and we're going to see some quotes from him in a minute, but he, upon hearing about this travesty of justice and others in his circle, he writes a book called The Catholic Concordance. And you can see in this amazing ideas for that time period, and these ideas you'll hear echoed in the Declaration of Independence. Natural law proceeds all human considerations and provide the principle for them all. First, nature intends every kind of animal to preserve its physical existence and its life, to avoid what could be harmful and to secure what is necessary to it. For the first requirement of essence is that it exists. But from the beginning, all men, have been endowed with reason, which distinguishes them from animals. They know because of the existence of their reason that association and sharing are most useful. The idea of commonwealth. Indeed, necessary for their self-preservation and to achieve the purpose of human existence. Therefore, by natural instinct, they have joined together and built villages and cities in which to live together. And if men had not established rules to preserve peace, the corrupt desires of many would have prevented this union from improving human life. For this reason, cities arose in which the citizens united and adopted laws with the common assent of all, to preserve unity and harmony, and they established guardians of all these laws with the power necessary to provide for the public good. There's no nation at this point that has those principles. These are simply principles being laid out by the mind of Nicholas of Cusa, as educated by the Platonists in the past. It was clear that by a marvelous and beneficent divine law infused in all men, they knew that associating together would be most beneficial to them. Social life would be maintained by laws adopted with the common consent. Servitude can be by choice. It is less worthy if by compulsion, and better if freely chosen, since good is more meritorious when performed freely than out of necessity. For nature does not make man a slave. So direct contradiction of Aristotle. No man is by nature a slave, but ignorance makes one a slave. Nor does manumission make one free, but learning. For those who live by the law are free, but true law is righteousness. True law is not carved on tablets nor cut in bronze, but stamped on the mind and imprinted on the senses. And that's, of course, what Plato says. That's what Leibniz argues later. You are not a tabula rasa, as John Locke and the British say, born as a nothing, and then you just learn whatever your senses tell you, that there is actually principles stamped in your soul. Very beautiful, profound idea. All legitimate power arises from the elective concordance and free submission. There is in the people a divine seed by virtue of the common equal birth and the equal natural rights of all men, so that the authority which comes from God, as does man himself, is recognized as divine. When it arises from the common consent of the subjects, one who is established in authority as representative of the will of all may be called a public or common person, the father of all, ruling without haughtiness or pride in a lawful and legitimate established government, while recognizing himself as a creature of all his subjects as a collectivity. Let him act as their father as individuals. So that could be a king, but not a haughty king, a king who recognizes he represents the general good of the people. It could be a president of the United States. We hope it would be. It is sufficient to know that free election based on natural and divine law does not originate from positive law, nor from any man upon whose will the validity of the election depends. This is particularly true of the election of a king or emperor, the election of a king or emperor. Think about that. Whose existence and power do not depend on any one man. Thus, the electors derive their basic authority fundamentally from the common consent of all those who could, by natural law, have created the emperor, and not the Roman pontiff, who has no authority to give any region in the world a king or emperor without its consent. So you also have there the division of church and state, that he's saying the Pope cannot impose any king on any nation. For this purpose, the public welfare, the ruler should have the best qualified of his subjects chosen from all parts of his realm to participate in a daily council with him. These counselors ought to represent all the inhabitants of the realm. These counselors ought to constantly to defend the good of the public, which they represent, giving advice and serving as the appropriate means through which the king can govern and influence his subjects. And the subjects, on proper occasion, can influence him in return. The great strength of the kingdom comes from this daily council. The counselors should be appointed to this task by agreement in a general meeting of the kingdom, and they should be publicly bound legally by oath to speak out openly for the public good. This is an absolute revolution of the concept of government in 1434. And again, it didn't exist yet, right? But he's laying out, this is what government should be. At the same time, you have projects to uplift the population. And this is the bricklayers working on the dome in Florence. It had been organized for over 100 years, but Brunelleschi in the end is the final mind who develops the capability of building this dome. And he uses negative curvature, and you can see the negative curvature there. Think of an umbrella. When you put up an umbrella, you have the curvature like this, but also within the spokes, you have curvature like that, right? So it's that negative curvature of the one curvature meeting with the other curvature that actually allows him to build a dome as large as he's able to build it. And you can see the beautiful paintings in there, and imagine how uplifted you would be by going into this dome. There's a statue of Brunelleschi looking at his dome, completed in 1436. So Nicholas of Cusa and his friends organized the Council of Florence in 1439, 3 years after the dome is completed. Albrigati is a good friend of Cusa. He is a Platonic scholar, and they bring in people from the Eastern Orthodox Church. The whole idea, 700 representatives of the Eastern Orthodox Church meeting with the Western Church. And the idea is that they are going to agree upon the idea of the filioque, that the Holy Spirit proceeds both from the Father and the Son, and so therefore it's a concept of man in the image of God, imago viva Dei, and participation with God, capax Dei. And it's agreed upon. It falls apart not long after, when Plethon and people go back to the Byzantine Empire. But in the process, Plethon brings a lot of Platonic writings, all of the writings of Plato. So they're all studying this. De Medici, he founds the Platonic Academy in Florence. He's also a very, very powerful banker. He finances the arts in his lifetime with $500 million equivalent at that time, $500 million, financing architecture, artists, poets, etc. That's his son, that's his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici the Great. This gentleman here, Louis, is the son of Charles VII, and he's very, very disgusted and frustrated by the lack of fight from his father, but he's sent into exile. His father doesn't like him very much either. And he's sent to exile in Dauphine, and while he's in Dauphine, he develops, he lifts cities up out of poverty, he brings in industry, he builds a postal system like Benjamin Franklin, all kinds of common good, general welfare, public works, and industry, protecting manufacturing and industry in this area. So he proves that it works here. In the meantime, you have this a series of popes that come into the papacy who are Renaissance popes, and they're all in these same circles of Cusa and Brunelleschi and all of these Platonic leaders in Florence. So he becomes Thomas Parentucelli becomes Pope Nicholas V. He's a librarian of Cosimo de' Medici, and he applauds the efforts of Henry the Navigator of Portugal, efforts to prove devotion to God by making the seas navigable. And Henry the Navigator is a problematic figure because at the same time that he is working on navigation, he is also beginning the horrific slave trade out of Western Africa. So I'm not going to sugarcoat this and say that everybody involved in this project is a great humanist figure. Perhaps the humanist figures were trying to use the power that he had to advance this project, but there's imperfections, just like in the creation of our republic. Now, this is the next pope, Piccolomini, Pope Pius II. He's very close friends with Cusa. He's very close friends with these others. And this is, just to give you a sense of him, this is his view of the Venetian oligarchs. He writes in his commentaries, as among brute beasts, aquatic creatures have the least intelligence, so among human beings, the Venetians are the least just and the least capable of humanity. They please only themselves, and while they talk, they listen to and admire themselves. When they speak, they think themselves sirens. They wish to appear Christian before the world, but in reality, they never think of God, and except for the state, which they regard as a deity, they hold nothing sacred. The Venetians aim at the dominion of Italy and all but dare aspire to the mastery of the world. It's important to bring in the Venetians. This is the Roman Empire. Remember, the Roman Empire is in Italy, right? So these guys always hung on to the idea of the Roman Empire. They never were interested in nations and humanism. Now, so what happens is that Pope Pius II, Cusa, Toscanelli, and you see another painting from Vasari here. There is Toscanelli next to Marsilio Ficino, who translated all of the works of Plato from Greek into Latin to spread Plato into the West. And Toscanelli is an astronomer, a map maker, a general Renaissance figure, kind of like Da Vinci, a little bit before Da Vinci. But they decide, we're going to try to create republics in Europe, but we're also going to be ready to go west across the ocean if we're not able to carry out this project in Europe if the Venetians and the oligarchs have too much power. The first attempt at creating this the republic is, we're back to Louis XI here, who's now free from Dauphine. He is now the king. Charles VII is dead, and Louis XI develops the entirety of France. He brings in the same thing he did in Dauphine. He protects the manufacturing, protects the general citizen of France from the feudal oligarchy. And this is a recurring theme. You see this later with like Tsar Alexander II fighting against the boyars, the landed aristocracy in Russia. So the fact that he's a king, just because he's a king doesn't mean he's bad. I mean, a king is not necessarily bad. It's not the best system of government, obviously. But at this point, you didn't have republics. So you had a king who actually put into his mind the defense of the general welfare and the general development of the nation. And that's what he does. At the same time, Toscanelli he produces a map. And you see the importance of this map is that you don't fall off the cliff, right, into you don't know what. The general thinking was, he thinks that's Asia, right? He doesn't have this entire continent in his map. The light blue is not from the light blue is, the light blue is brought in later to show the reality. Sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. This is a corrected view, a corrected map of Toscanelli. But what he says is that you can get to China, you can get to Asia by sailing across. So he writes in 1480 to Christopher Columbus and provides him this map and says, you can get across. There's a lot of history in this, which I'm not going to be able to get into, but it's a really fascinating thing. So this Italian Renaissance outlook basically organizes the first attempt to get to the New World. Now back to France, Louis XI, on his deathbed, essentially 1483, he writes to his son Charles VIII, and also I'll bring in this other person in a minute, but he writes to his son the Rose Bush of War. And there's just a few things in here. He writes, who wishes to die a good death must seek to have a good soul. Since everything, including our creation, comes from God, we must desire that our souls return to him by doing such good works, like Benjamin Franklin, that the memory of them will be in perpetual benediction. It is a good and charitable thing to risk one's life to defend the common good, which concerns all estates, that is, the commonwealth of the realm. Consider the duty of kings and princes and their cavaliers, that their estate and vocation is to defend the common good, both ecclesiastic and secular, to uphold justice and peace among their subjects, and to do good. And because the common good, which concerns many, which is the commonweal of the realm, is more praiseworthy than the particular, which often has frustrated the common good, we have freely put into writing the acts of the princes and the cavaliers, and all good doctrines which serve their estate. I have seen nothing which so destroyed and annihilated the power of the Romans as when they betook themselves more to the particular than to the common good. A good king is a king is good and noble. When kings have no regard for the law, they deny to the people what they ought to have left to them. It says, no man should be called the king, but he who rules and has seigniory over free men. For free men of their nature love their lords, while serfs naturally hate them, like slaves their masters. A good king should resemble a good and beautiful flowing river, which brings benefit to each man. A king must not be too strict. He must be merciful. You get the idea here. Cities were from the first the name for the common good or the commonwealth. A city is the assembly of people to inhabit one place, to live under one law, the common good. Otherwise, the prince must provide for the maintenance of the public works and edifices and to make improvements and repairs on the roads, the bridges, the ports, the walls, the moats, and the other things in his towns and castles which are necessary in such a manner that the people be not aggrieved. So you hear in this 50 years later, you hear reflected what Cusa was laying out in his idea of what government should be, what a king should be. So you do have not only an attempt, but the creation of the first nation state in Europe. Henry VII was brought by his uncle Jasper Tudor to France during the War of the Roses that was going on in England. He came and studied under Henry XI. He regulated foreign trade to promote national economic development. He outlawed usury, promoted cloth and other industry with export duties, developed the iron industry, was able to defeat Richard III with really solid cannonballs from French technology, iron blast furnaces, builds a navy, but has a foreign policy for peace. And he brings in Erasmus, which Dennis was talking about earlier, Thomas More, John Colet. And these three are the center of the English Renaissance. So you have Renaissances in many, many different places. And I just want to make a point about that in a minute. Now, so Henry VIII, the son of Henry VII, people have a lot of excellent expectations about this guy. He was steeped in the classical tradition. He had the best education. He saw the precedent of his father building this amazing nation of England, the development of England. He's trained, and he brings in Thomas More. And at a certain point, Thomas More actually becomes his chief advisor. And then he decides that he wants to marry Anne Boleyn. He wants to divorce Catherine of Aragon. It's a whole Venetian manipulation. They basically seduce him at a masked ball with Anne Boleyn. And he assumes that Thomas More will just go along with this because he is his counselor. He's the counselor to the king. And Thomas More says, no, absolutely not. Because what Henry asserts is that because the Catholic Church won't give him the right for divorce, he says, well, then I am the head of the church. I create my own church, the Church of England. And all must agree with that. And Thomas More says, I don't agree. And so he's taken to the chopping block. His head chopped off. But there's a person with principle, More had principle. But this is the beginning of the Venetian takeover in England. And you can see the problem that Cusa and his friends were dealing with is that how do you get this Republican conception to actually take root and flourish in this oligarchical dominated Europe? So you have Amerigo Vespucci, who is in dialogue with Columbus. This is a painting of him as a young man by Vasari, the same Renaissance painter. He is friends and writing back and forth with Lorenzo the Magnificent's cousin, I believe, Lorenzo Popolano de' Medici, a painting by Botticelli, another Renaissance painter. This is an older picture of Amerigo Vespucci, and he also takes a series of trips he sails to the New World a number of times, and you can see the development of the map here. 1507, how much more developed. You can see the Americas on the left-hand side, the way you're looking, by Waldseemüller, and also Matthias Ringman, a map maker. You can see all of a sudden you have a globe. You're not falling. There's no more idea that you're going to fall off the earth. You have a globe, and so this is obviously very, very important for what's going to come. About 100 years later, Captain John Smith arrives in Virginia. Bradford and the Pilgrims arrive in 1620 in New England, and John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, arrives in Massachusetts, obviously. And so this is the beginning of the attempt to bring these Republican ideas to the New World to see if they can actually flourish and develop. And one funny thing about John Smith, everybody knows that, the quote from him, "If you don't work, you don't eat." And so people think of this as, well, everybody's got to work, right? Well, actually, this was a direct polemic to some of the nobility that came with him on the ships. So they wanted to see everybody else work, and they were going to live off of that. And he said, "No, brother, here, if you don't work, you don't eat." Okay, great. So now I want to thank you very much. I want to introduce Bob Wesser, who's going to take the story from there.
Okay, so since I was originally asked to talk about what really happened at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, well, what really happened is what Chris went through, and what I'm going to go through here. Okay. Anyway, so this is a famous watercolor etching of the battle on Lexington Green. But I'm going to start with, I'm glad that Dennis Speed began with the talking about the book. It's actually this book here, How the Nation Was Won by Graham Lowry. And the best way to do history is to approach it from destroying popular myths and opinion. If you approach it from that standpoint, you're going to start getting more at the truth of stuff. So in his introduction to this book, Graham says the following. And he's talking about the popular historians' myths about what happened with the American Revolution and the creation of our nation. He says the typically resulting accounts peddle two crucially misleading claims. First, that the Puritan development of New England was some sort of historical quirk, terminated before 1700 by its own irrelevance, without any lasting influence. Second, that the American colonies merely existed during the first half of the 18th century in a static, uneventful mode with no significant thought or purpose for the future. Then a further claim is added that Americans simply fought the French and Indian War in support of British colonial policy. Only after that war, according to our standard history texts, did the idea of independence emerge in response to Britain's imperial measures following the 1763 Treaty of Paris. The final blow is usually thus delivered. The American Revolution was the unpredicted outcome of colonists' sudden hostility to imperial rule over such matters as the Stamp Act and the tax on tea. In other words, the founding of the greatest republic in history resulted from nothing more than a spontaneous spring of protests against British infringement upon some petty rights the colonials already, quote unquote, enjoyed. It is simply a matter of record that John Winthrop's Massachusetts Bay Project was dedicated to establishing a republic in the New World as a strategic flank, which is what Chris just went through, against the threatened destruction of Europe during the first decades of the 17th century. By the way, people should go on Amazon and buy that book. It's $20. It's worth it. Okay, so here, what did they do? So they come over, and John Winthrop basically organizes a coup. Those other plantations that Chris showed, Bradford, Plymouth Plantation, etc., they're governed from London. What Winthrop does in 1629 is he gets the charter. He gets the king to actually sign the papers that allow them to take the charter back to New England, and they can govern themselves. So what do? They create their own currency. They create a credit system. They build the most modern, ironworks in the world at that time. The Saugus Ironworks with people up in Boston there have probably been to or should go to see. We have our own currency, the pine tree shilling. And within a few years, the Crown's like, this is not, we didn't sign up for this. You are not going to do this. So there's a back and forth. Oh, that's the other thing that they set up, I forgot to mention, is the what they call training bands. So this was part of creating their new country. These were very highly trained militia units that drilled regularly every month they met, et cetera. So this is a critical part of defending their new form of government. So anyway, the Crown tries to crack down on this, and there's a back and forth, and Winthrop says the following to the Lord Commissioner. He says, well, if our parent be taken from us, i.e. the British Empire, the king, whereby we suppose we may claim interest in his majesty's favor and protection, right? The common people here will conceive that his majesty has cast them off, and that thereby they are freed from their allegiance and subjection, and thereupon we'll be ready to confederate themselves in a new government for our necessary safety and subsistence. So, of course, they never had any intentions of doing anything under the authority of the Crown. So it's an absolute defiance. Oh, by the way, that's the, you can see that's only 1650. They already have that big New England Confederation set up. So this is the beginning of the new nation. And I have to point out, the intention of this the entire time was to conquer the entire continent for this project. They were very, very, very clear about this. It wasn't just, oh, we're going to go here in New England and set up these little colonies. No, it's a continent, continental army, right? Continental Congress. That's the intention the whole time. So this goes on, it grows, and there's a lot of stuff that's going on inside England at this point in terms of the politics, which we don't have time to go through. But at a certain point, the Crown says, no way, you're not going to do this. And they send over this guy, Edmund Andros. Oops, getting confused. There he is, on the left. And within a few days, the order is given by Mather and the Patriots in Boston that Andros, who's sent in by the Crown to take away the charter, take away their sovereignty, end the whole project, ain't going to happen. And they're able to mobilize 1,000 armed militia men. And they go to Andros's house in Boston and they, hi, guess what? You're going home. And there he is. You can't see it. It's a little, on the left there, you see Andros being let out, humiliated in his arms bound, right? On the right is Cotton Mather. Now, the other point I want to make about this is when they set up what people have heard of as the committees of safety. And you say, oh, well, these are the training bands and it's military stuff. No, one of the first things that Mather does is issue a paper called Some Considerations on the Bill of Credit. So after they get Andros out, they're now going to reestablish a credit system, right? Which we'll hear more about later. Very interesting. Okay, so after the Andros Rebellion, the British moved big time to corrupt. To corrupt the project in New England. For example, you have people have heard of the Salem witch trials. So this is a major oligarchical operation to terrify everything. It's only put to the end is put to it by the Mathers. You have a populist party that's organized by the British, a kind of Jacobin party. Cotton Mather calls it the party of Satan. So there's an extended operation. Harvard College, which was set up by us as a school of classical learning, is taken over by the British. So we're not able to relaunch the offensive at that time in New England, and it comes out of two locations, Virginia and New York, and actually New Jersey. And there's a whole thing that goes on around the new monarch in England, Queen Anne, who's friendly to these things for all sorts of reasons, which we don't have time to go through, but it's in the book if you read it. And in Virginia, you have Governor Spotswood, and in New York, you have Governor Robert Hunter. These are both Scottish. They're both Scotsmen, very highly trained military men, and their idea is to relaunch the opening again of the whole continent. So Spotswood does an amazing exploration to find the passageway, the gap of the Appalachian Mountains into the Shenandoah River Valley, which would then open up the Ohio. Robert Hunter is an ally of his. These guys both fought in wars in Europe. In New York, that's the only natural opening across the Appalachian Mountain chain is through the Mohawk River Valley, which gets you into the entire Great Lakes system. So if you get into the Great Lakes system up through New York, which is later the Erie Canal, and you get into the Ohio River Valley system, you're basically the continent's open. The guy on the lower left there is the grandfather of what Jose Vega was talking about, Gouverneur Morris. And he was the governor of New York and New Jersey both at some point. He was allied with these guys in this whole project. The other operation they pull, and this is important because the way this thing was set up is that every time we try to go west, the French oligarchs, and they used the Jesuits to do this, would use corrupted Indians, Native Americans from Canada to come down and carry out massacres against frontier settlements of the Patriots. Because otherwise, in New England and in New York, you know, the Iroquois Confederation would work with us like this. We were like brothers and sisters. It was absolutely no problem. Same thing in Virginia with the Tuscaroras and Spotswood. So all this mythology about, you know, we created the nation by killing the Indians. Yeah, well, the British did that and the French did it. We didn't. So you can see by the map there, these, you know, terrorists being sent down by the Jesuits and the French to harass our settlements. And so what happened is, and this is like really the revival of the Patriots in New England, is the New England Patriots under the leadership of the governor who was named Shirley, organized a military operation to go all the way up from Boston to Cape Breton. And there was a major, you can see that's kind of like the choke point into the St. Lawrence. So that was the big French fort. So we say, okay, you know what? We're not going to ask the king. We're not going to ask any authority. We're going to organize the military operation and we're going to take that darn fort. And we did it. And the British were freaked. They actually gave it back to the French later on, right? But it kind of began the whole rebirth of the Patriots in New England. So this is George Washington. He comes out of the whole Spotswood project in Virginia to breach the Appalachians, to open up the Ohio River Valley. He was responsible in many large ways, and it's also in the book, of actually starting in America, the French and Indian War. Remember, that was the 7 Years' War. It was a world war between the French and the British. But he started here. Why? Because we wanted to organize military operations to kick the French the heck out of North America so we could carry out the Continental Project. That was the idea. And it basically worked. The Louisburg thing was the beginning of that. Part of this was, and I'm glad that Dennis Speed went through some of the stuff on Franklin earlier, because it's exactly what he did. He went from Boston, which had been corrupted after this Andros Rebellion, and he was sent to Philadelphia. But part of his plan of the 7 Years' War was to create the Albany Plan of Union, which would have allowed the coordination of American military militias of all the different colonies. And the British said, no, you're not doing that. No way, right? So it didn't work. But you can see this is 1850, 1754, already the beginnings of an coordinated armed revolution. So what comes out of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, as you can see on the left there, I'm sorry. See on the left there, that whole green splotch there, that's French before the war. So you can see you see the little pink on the right, on the left-hand map, that's the only thing that is English colonies, except Canada, parts of Canada. So after the war, you see there's no green anymore on the right. No more green, no more French. Huge plotch of pink, which is now English, British, which goes into the Ohio River Valley. So the Crown immediately issues a proclamation. No more American settlements beyond, and they draw a line, which is essentially the Appalachian Mountain chain. So that's it. They're going to shut this thing down. There is not going to be any continental republic. You ain't going to do it, and you're not allowed to go past this line. So, of course, you can imagine what patriots at this point are thinking. And the rest is just a rapid timeline, because a decision is made, we are going to shut this down. We're not going to let this continental republic come into place, not on our watch, right? And you get these whole series of acts that everybody knows, learns in elementary school or junior high school or whatever. The Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Quartering of Soldiers, the Stamp Act, which we stop, right? Townsend Acts. You have the Boston Tea Party in 1774, and then the coercive acts against that. And basically, the whole city of Boston is shut down. You can't go in and out. The port's closed. There's sentries in and out of the city. It's a complete police state. So what do? Our response, September 1774, we organized the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress, right? The whole continent. And that's, of course, all the existing colonies. They meet in Philadelphia. Two very important people, Sam Adams on the left, who people know as Sons of Liberty and the beer and all that. I guess he liked beer, I don't know. Anyway, he's pointing to the Massachusetts Charter. So that's what the painting is, right? On the right, you have Paul Revere. Paul Revere was appointed, what they call him the Mercury, the Patriotic Mercury. He was appointed to do rapid fire communication between Boston, Philadelphia, New York. And he made those trips 5 times. And that's what he did. So if someone made a decision in Philadelphia, he had to get his people to New York City. And this is all within the constraints of the British still running the colonies. Keep that in mind, right? This is the guy sent in by the Crown to basically shut the whole operation down, British General Thomas Gage, who's not a really horrible person. In fact, some of the things that George III tells him to do, you have to do this. He doesn't do it. He said, that's not, I have to have the legal basis to do that. But he is sent in to do it. He is ordered to basically disarm us. That's the idea, and grab the ringleaders, if you will. So here's the plan. So now, by the way, we have a great intelligence network throughout all of New England by this point. So we know all these things way before they happen. So Lexington conquered, that plan we knew about 10 days beforehand. In fact, we thought it was going to happen before it did, right? So what's the plan? What they're going to do is they're going to send a contingency from Boston, and they're going to capture, they think, John Hancock and Sam Adams are in Lexington, so they're going to capture them, arrest them, maybe kill them if it's middle of the night, if they can get away with it. And then they're going to go to Concord, which is where the provincial Congress of Massachusetts had been meeting, the provincial assembly. And also that's where the stores were, gunpowder, cannon, muskets. So they're going to grab all that and then come back. And they're going to do this, if you can see, can't see the timeline here, but it starts at, like basically 11 o'clock at night on the 18th, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night on the 18th of April, right? And they're going to, this is all going to be one day. They're going to march overnight, they're going to do all this, and then they come back, right? Piece of cake. So, this is, and you see the top I have in quotes, Paul Revere's rides. Now, you think one guy could have done all that, those black lines in 8 hours? I don't think so. So Paul Revere had a whole network of messengers. There was a core of like 4 or 5 or 6 of them, and they had this thing all organized. So they would go to one right into town, and they'd find, Levi Jones. Hey, Levi, blah, 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 blah. Ah, I got it. He'd be able to mobilize the town further north. So they could do all this. This is all in the span of, by the time the first engagement starts in the morning, at 9 in the morning, everybody already knows about it. Everybody in Middlesex County is mobilized. The training bands, the militia, what people call today the Minutemen, right? Because they could supposedly get themselves organized in a minute. So that's the so-called Paul Revere's ride. Another mythology, right? The lantern thing is true, though, but we'll talk about that at the moment. So this is the first engagement, somewhat of a happenstance. They didn't expect, I don't think they expected to meet any resistance in Lexington, but we only have about 70 or 80 guys there. Lexington, they didn't call themselves the Minutemen. In Lexington, they called themselves the training band, going back to Winthrop. Interesting, right? So these people are thinking in decades and decades and decades. So the British regulars that are sent out under the command of this guy, Colonel Smith, they're green. Most of these guys have never seen battle. With the Americans, it's completely different. These commanders of these militia units, they went through the 7 Years' War. They fought through the Indian Wars. They're excellent marksmen. So it's completely the opposite of what we're usually told. Oh, this is the big British army. And one of the things that happens at Lexington is the regulars just go out of control. They just ignore the orders and they start shooting like crazy. And that's what this graphic, which was done like a few days after the battle, shows. You see on the left there, a lot of dead Americans. So we retreat from Lexington. But that's actually the first shot. It's not Concord. And nobody knows who fired it, because the Patriot militias were told, always under orders, and this was a political policy, we don't fire first. When they fire the first shot, game's on. Okay, now here's the thing. So they're going to march back off. Now already the British are freaked out because they weren't even expecting anything in terms of resistance, especially a well-organized one. So I can't go through the time. We don't have time to go through all the details of Concord, but there's a famous thing about Concord Bridge, right? So you have the British on the right. Oops, yeah, okay. Coming in. The bridge is that little yellow circle. And by then we have at least 400, there's actually more, but 400 militia under Barrett. They're extremely organized, very well disciplined. And they're not, nobody, so the British start firing. We don't fire, nobody fires until this happens. So this is Major John Buttrick. So on the left, you see the Americans coming onto the bridge. On the right, you can see the redcoats. And they're getting real close, but no one's firing. And the British start firing. And Buttrick finally says, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire." Now, what's fascinating about this, you see that little house there which says home of Major Buttrick? That's his house. They settled there in 1638. So this is in their blood. They're animated by this. This isn't just, oh, there's some bad red coat. I mean, they know what's at stake here. So the British really get their butts handed to them. And everybody kind of knows some of the stories of the retreat. You know, you have the British Army retreating then. They want to go back to Boston. And there's very, very well organized battle lines created by us along the way to engage them. And it just freaks them out because they have no way to deal with it. And even though 1,000 reinforcements come in, you see there on the right, it says Percy, and we meet them at Lexington, we shift our strategy somewhat. But the stupid Percy, this is the way they are like through the whole war. They just like think I don't know, they're oblivious to what we really are. So he doesn't bring enough gunpowder. Each soldier only has 35 cartridges. That's nothing, right? They bring a couple cannon. They don't have enough powder or cannonballs. They weren't expecting even to fight. So at a certain point, through these various engagements on the way back, they have to just retreat and hightail it back to Boston. And that's the beginning of the end of the British Empire, which we're in the middle of right now, if you haven't noticed. That's the end of their empire. So within a month and a half, in June of 1775, George Washington of Virginia, Spotswood, Ohio River Valley exploration fame, is elected to be the commander-in-chief of the new army. What do we call it? The Colonial Army, the New England Army? No, it's the Continental Army, because we're creating a continental republic. And so it's very important, right? Because he's not in Virginia doing this. They don't say, okay, you're going to be the general, and okay, I'll organize the army. No, he comes to Massachusetts because this is already organized. Now, I'm going to end with this, and at some point we'll go through the revolution and this and that, and we'll do more presentations on it, especially more presentation on Graham's book and this stuff in it. But I just love this. So 65 years later, after Lexington conquered, a young academic journalist guy is interviewing 91-year-old Danvers militia captain Levi Preston, right? So he was at the Battle of Lexington Concord 65 plus years earlier. So here's the interview. Captain Preston, why, what made you go to the Concord fight? What did I go for? Well, were you oppressed by the Stamp Act? I never saw any stamps. I always understood that none were ever sold. Well, what about the tea tax? Tea tax? I never drank a drop of this stuff. The boys threw it all overboard. Well, I suppose you've been reading Harrington and Sidney and Locke about the eternal principle of liberty? I never heard of these men. The only books we had were the Bible, the Catechism, Watts, Psalms and hymns, and almanacs. Well, what was the matter? Young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We always had governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should.
Great. Thank you, Bob. So next we have our final speaker, the president of the LaRouche Organization and the woman who made this meeting happen, Diane Sayre.
Okay, who has my slides? I don't want that. May I give it to you? Great. Okay. So what I want to talk about is actually the extreme importance of understanding the principles of physical economy as Lyndon LaRouche developed it as one of the he was a universal genius. And if you ever talk to him, which I had the opportunity to do frequently, he would say, well, I'm really 2,500 years old, because he thought of history as universal, and all the ideas that you heard going back to Plato and Socrates and Plato versus Aristotle was really in his blood. By the age of 14, he'd read virtually everything by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. I know that he was precocious because years ago, when my husband and I met and we were organizing in New Hampshire, where LaRouche was born, I met someone who had been a classmate of his in his high school, whose last name was La something else. They seated everyone by alphabetical order. And the person said, he was such a pain. He was always correcting the teacher. He was a wise, and that's sort of what he was like. And I put him next to Alexander Hamilton because Hamilton was the genius who developed the system of economy which allowed our nation to develop. And I hope you have heard enough here to understand, and Jose stressed it a bit, and Dennis, that our nation did not become economically prosperous because of slavery. It is just a total myth. And I want to go to what Hamilton said about slavery, which I think is the next slide. Is it, or is it LaRouche? Yeah. He said, and this is in something he wrote in 1774, were not the disadvantages of slavery too obvious to stand in need of it, I might enumerate and describe the tedious train of calamities inseparable from it. I might show that it is fatal to religion and morality, that it tends to debase the mind and corrupt its noblest springs of action. I might show that it relaxes the sinews of industry, clips the wings of commerce, and introduces misery and indigence in every shape. The page of history is replete with instances that loudly warn us to beware of slavery. And Frederick Douglass describes in his autobiography, because when he was a slave in the South, everyone said, oh, you don't want to go to the North. I mean, people, they don't have anyone to bring in the laundry, and they don't have anyone to get their water. And he gets to the North and discovers, whoa, indoor plumbing. The standard of living was far higher, because what can you do with your body? And suppose you do spend a lot of money going to the gym and you are super strong. Can you really lift a lot more than a slave somewhere 500 years ago? No. There is an absolute limit. You will never advance beyond a certain point. And that's why the British pushed and promoted slavery, was to make sure that this republic never developed. And they revived it when it was about to go extinct by moving the sugar plantations from the Caribbean into South Carolina. And I'll tell you, Hamilton, as people may know, was born out of wedlock, born in Nevis, and witnessed firsthand as a child the total depravity of the slave system. Slavery was horrific in the United States, but in the Caribbean, the sugar plantations, the slaves did not even live a few months. They were so violent, so hideously. It was just a genocide, and Hamilton was witness to this. So you can imagine coming to the United States, his view, like the view of Franklin Roosevelt at the end of World War II, when he told Churchill, we are not fighting in this war against fascism so you can keep all your colonies. Hamilton was not coming over here to work with George Washington to create a replica of the British Empire. Now, there's a very important distinction, and people don't know it. And if we don't know it, we will have World War III. That is, the military policy doesn't come first. The economic policy comes first, and the wars come because of the economic policy. I think it's the quote from Linnex. Is that right? No. Okay. Do you have maybe I didn't get it in there. No, just forget it. It's not here. So we'll get to that. Can you get rid of the slide? Just black him out. Thank you. So in this paper, which I just rediscovered from LaRouche, called Up from the Ruin, which the Roman empires have made of this world, and this was from 2011, and it's an incredible paper because he talks about the Treaty of Westphalia and the idea that we have had, and we've had it since really World War I. We've had nothing but war. And it's the whole planet. And we know about what's happening in Palestine because people are very literate and they have cell phones, and we see it, and it is horrible. But we don't hear that much about what's happening in South Sudan, where 150,000 people are dead now. There is a similar targeting of medical people, of journalists. We hear virtually nothing about what's happening in Haiti right now. Haiti, which is a republic whose constitution in part was drafted by Alexander Hamilton. And I think maybe for that reason, because it was not white and because it was to be a republic, the British in particular and the French had a special desire to crush the place and make sure it never developed. And one of the hideous things about Haiti that people may or may not know is their nation was hopelessly indebted to the French, because when they declared their independence, the French said, you have to pay us back for all the slaves that you've taken from us. I mean, you cannot. So LaRouche in this paper says something about money. He says the difference between the use of money by what is called a monetarist system and the use of what may appear superficially to be the same notion of money under a credit system lies in the specifically ontological distinction of a credit system from a monetarist system. The difference is nearly the same as between the US dollar and a commercial banking system under the US Constitution's provisions, such as the provisions for US dollars circulating within a credit system, and a contrary practice expressed by the morally corrupt misuse of a US dollar when circulating through the intrinsically speculative channels of Wall Street or the London financial markets. Okay, so it's the same dollar, but what does it do? So now we can go to and I picked 10. When I did this years ago, I used $1, but I realized we've had inflation, and plus Hamilton is on the $10 bill. So Hamilton says in the quote that's next, but we can skip, I'll read it to you and we don't have to go there. It is evident, for instance, that the money which a merchant keeps in his chest, waiting for a favorable opportunity to employ it, produces nothing till that opportunity arrives. Okay, so if you have $10, you can just hold it. And there it is. Nothing happens. Now, suppose I have $10 and I say to Jenny, I'd like you to knit a sweater for me for $10. You must be, she's slave labor almost. I'm going to give you this $10 for that sweater. So she knits the sweater. And then Jose, she's going to give Jose $10 because he is going to bake some incredible dinner for 6 people. So she's going to give him the $10. And then Jose is going to pay Hannah for a beautiful painting, which she's going to produce, $10. And then Hannah is going to use that $10 to go to the art store and buy paint and paintbrushes from Jane. And then Jane is going to take the $10 and go buy coffee. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but what? Matthew? Mafu. Okay, yes. And then you're going to take this $10 and go to Marcel, who's going to give you a class in Shakespeare. And then Marcel is going to take the $10 that he gets to Margaret, and she's going to give him a piano lesson. And then we're all going to get to have a concert, and we're going to bring in an audience, and they're all going to pay $10 each to come to the concert. And we're going to end up with $1,000, and we're going to go put it in a bank. Now, all that activity with no one is, they're not keeping the money. It's being used to cause people to actually do things. And if you wanted to really think about it, it gets unbelievably complicated, because for Jenny to make the sweater, she actually had to get the wool from somewhere, and the sheep that made the wool had to eat, and the food for the sheep came from somewhere, right? In other words, the whole economy is so unbelievably intertwined that, in a sense, the money, the currency, is only an instrument to allow you to engage in this kind of activity. And Hamilton understood this very, very clearly, which is why he wrote this thing on the question of a national bank. And I will just say, because I had a conversation with someone the other day who said, oh, well, we don't need a bank. We have blockchain. We don't need banks. And I said, well, what owner of blockchain is going to build a transcontinental railroad? What owner of blockchain is going to make sure that everybody has clean drinking water? Is a private person going to actually do this? And Hamilton, and I will say this, our dear moderator, Jason Ross, made sure that this little book got published. These are his 4 most significant papers on the lines of economy, The Vision of Alexander Hamilton. You can order it online, Amazon, I hate to say, but anyway, it has his paper on the question of public credit, on the subject of the national bank, on the constitutionality of the national bank, because there was always a fight from pro-British agents to get rid of the national bank and to say it was unconstitutional. And then Hamilton's paper on the subject of manufactures. Now, what I said about this kind of trade, if you only did it in that way, that's very linear and ultimately, frankly, would be entropic, because there's costs involved that are not in just the thing. And that's the problem of being a consumer economy, which we've been since the 60s and 70s. We don't really produce. But if you thought from the standpoint of credit, that is, after that big concert where we ended up generating $1,000 and we only started with a 10, and all that money went in the bank and could be lent out again, what happens if a farmer borrows that money and is able to produce an enormous quantity of food, which is then sold at market, and he ends up generating 3 times the revenue that he borrowed? And so what's happening is the wealth, there is a monetary metric of the wealth. When we went to the moon, for example, we generated $10 for every dollar that was spent, but it wasn't really money, was it? It was actually the activity that happened in the society as the result of the circulation of that so-called money. And what LaRouche warned about in 1971, he warned that Nixon was going to destroy the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system had its various imperfections, but it was intended, and FDR died before World War II ended. So it could not, and the British wanted him dead. It was LaRouche's view, LaRouche being a World War II veteran, that the British prolonged the war deliberately to make sure that FDR would be dead by the end of it. So he could not make sure that there was a level playing field and that every nation had its independence. But nonetheless, at the Bretton Woods system, certain things were established, including a system of fixed exchange rates. That is, you couldn't speculate against someone else's currency. And the dollar was pegged to a certain value of gold, and it was a reserve system. That is, you don't want to restrict the ability to issue your currency based on how much gold you have, because then you don't have the ability to have credit. But you want to say, okay, if in an emergency or to settle an international debt, you can use X amount of gold for the dollar and it's stable. So someone in Mexico who wants to borrow $30,000 and the peso is 2 to the dollar, they know 20 years from now when they're going to repay the 60,000 pesos, it's still going to be 60,000 pesos. once Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold reserve system, oh, suddenly you could say, well, yeah, we'll give you a loan, but guess what? Your currency is too valuable. So it might be 2 pesos to the dollar now, but when you repay that loan, it's going to be 50 pesos to the dollar. And guess what? Then Mexico gets to pay back 25 times what they borrowed plus interest. Feels like a student loan almost. And that was how countries were enslaved, was this policy. Now, there's also the idea on this question of credit that you think for the future. And I think we have this quote from LaRouche, which sounds really complicated. Yes, this is from this paper, but think about it. The presumption is that the usefulness of the output of production as measured in terms of the consumption which is temporarily withheld in the name of physically efficient credit, can be foreseen with a sufficiently good approximation that the net result, as measured in terms of physical usefulness, is greater than the amount of consumption which is postponed in the name of credit. And I'll give an example of that. In Egypt, they actually made a mistake in the funding of the doubling of the Suez Canal, because what the government did to fund that is they floated a bond, which was brilliant, and we met people in New York who were thrilled to put in their last $10, and I forget, I think that it paid 7% or 12%. It paid very good interest. They got everybody to invest in building the canal, and then they were paid a rate of return, and they used the money in that they collected to build the canal, whereas had they, instead of just taking that money and then spending it on the canal, had a national bank where they put the money, but then they issued in the form of credit. They issued it in forms of a loan. So rather than spending the thing immediately on the consumption of the moment, you're saying, well, we're not going to spend this now. It's going to be a form of credit because the good we will get in the future is greater than what we're not spending it on right now. And that's very important. It's a very important conception. People rail against fractional banking, that you should never lend out more than you have, which again is not true, right? But you count on the bank to be able to judge, or you have collateral, you're actually going to lend, you can lend out more money than you have, right? Because it's the activity. Again, it's the activity. And that's the problem that people really have in terms of thinking about economics. They measure it in money. It's a terrible, I watched Elon Musk in Guadalajara. He was giving this speech about why we have to colonize Mars. Now, we really do have to colonize Mars. And let me just say that the space program, again, when you're doing something that's really bold beyond where you are, when we went to the moon, we did not spend money on the moon. There are no banks, there are no shops. We were not spending money on the moon. We were spending money here to employ people, to make discoveries, to figure out how we could get there. And what happened as a result of that investment is these people discovered all kinds of things because they didn't know how to get to the moon. So we had microwaves and laptops and Velcro and Teflon and all of these other things that came out of this process of trying to figure out how you could actually get a human being to the moon. We're going to learn a lot from these poor astronauts who were stranded on the space station outrageously about the effects of zero gravity on the human body and the effect of what happens when you get gravity back. And are there implications of this for treating diseases? Or, there's an enormous amount to learn. Again, how do you measure this in dollars, right? It's not dollars. The dollar allows you to do this. So Musk gave this whole speech about going to Mars. And what he said is we have to make going to Mars cheap because we want everybody to be able to buy a ticket to go there. What you can't, and so he's not talking about that we have to have fusion propulsion, which is something LaRouche was working. If you're going to have all that time and space, why not be able to accelerate at the rate of gravity, decelerate at the rate of gravity? Don't put your body through that stress. You can't do it with chemical rockets. You need fusion. At least we got to get to fission, but fusion, if you're thinking about it from the money standpoint, you say, well, how do we make the cheapest kind of fuel possible so every Tom, Dick, and Harry can fly to Mars? You're not going to have the science driver that you need. Although I appreciate that he had an idea of doing it. It's one of these things that's so peculiar where there's a right idea, but the way of getting there is completely wrong. Similarly with the tariffs that we're hearing about, there was a point they talked about. If you're a new country and you're trying to develop your industry, you have a protective tariff so someone doesn't flood your market. Like the Poles are getting really angry at the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians are blowing things up in the Black Sea and they're not shipping their grain out. So they're flooding Poland with Ukrainian grain, which is cheap. And the Polish farmers are going out of business. It's one of those things that maybe Poland isn't going to be as a reliable partner as they think in this whole war scenario. So Poland would want to have protective tariffs to protect their farmers from the Ukrainian cheap goods that are coming through their country. That's the purpose of tariffs. Tariffs are not a punishment like sanctions. Oh, no, we're not going to. And it is really, someone said it, and I have to say it's the case that the question of the tariffs are like the guy who goes to a bank and he points the gun at his own head. And then he says to the bank teller, don't laugh because you're next. Right? That's our tariff policy right now. Now, I just quickly want to get, and you got to get out your Hamilton and read it because it's just so incredible. And what you realize is all these jerks who run around talking about the economy and money and this and that have no clue about our country. He wrote a paper on the subject of manufacturers, and I think that's the next one. Okay, what is that? Oh, yeah. So we read that. Next. Yes. So this, you think about our dollar circulating around, and this is what Hamilton says on the subject of manufacturers, which was a big argument because people were saying that where does wealth come from? Well, it's the land, it's the farms, it's agriculture. And he said, no, if you invest in manufacturers, then you are going to discover that you're producing much more on your farms. The standard of living is rising. And you see here, he said, what is the purpose of this, the economy? To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind. Think about that. Activity of the human mind. By multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. Even things in themselves not positively advantageous sometimes become so by their tendency to provoke exertion. Right? An obstacle comes up and you have to solve it. You have to solve the problem. Lo and behold, you discover something which is of great benefit. Every new scene which is opened to the busy nature of man to rouse and exert itself is the addition of a new energy to this general stock of effort. So this was the conception of our first Treasury Secretary and the guy who ran the National Bank. And what no one will ever teach you in any economics class in any university in the United States. Next, on the same thing, the benefits of manufacturing. So he says, a greater division of labor. an extension of the use of machinery, additional employment to classes of the community not normally engaged in the business. In other words, if you have a bunch of machines, you're going to have people specialize, people are going to develop certain kinds of skills, and what you're going to need is a more and more diverse workforce. We see that in medicine today. People specialize in all kinds of things, and it's a specialty. It's really a lot of work to just concentrate on that very little area. The promoting of emigration from foreign countries, the furnishing greater scope for the diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from each other, the offering of a more ample and various field for enterprise, the creating in some instances a new and securing in all a more certain and steady demand for the surplus produce of the soil. Each of these circumstances has a considerable influence upon the total mass of industrious effort in a community. Together, they add to it a degree of energy and effect which are not easily conceived. So, next slide. What happened once we figured out how to use machines? This is a chart of population growth starting at 1000 BC, where it's close to zero. I don't know what it was really, below a million on the whole planet, they say. It's hard to know. They're discovering things, more and more interesting things. But the Greek classical period, it's slowly growing. The Italian Renaissance, and if you look at a more refined chart, you'll see a little dip where all those people died of the Black Death in Europe. And then the European Renaissance at 1600, 1650, that last black line is 1900, and then look at how population grew. And not only did population grow, but guess what? Life expectancy got longer. Infant mortality went down. That is, the way people lived became better. People could become better educated. One advantage of having a bunch of robots do physical work that people might now be doing is maybe those people can only work 20 hours a week, and then they can have a string quartet or a chorus or learn 7 languages. And the society becomes more and more complex. Maybe people will have to stay in school until they're 28 years old to be able to take advantage, to understand all of the technology that's at use in that society. And to do this requires, next, you have to consume more energy. This is per capita, which means the curve is not going up as much as you might see. And frankly, it's not going up as much as I think it really should. But if you're burning wood, you're clearly not going to have 8 billion people on the planet because you are going to run out of wood. And not only that, if you look at Haiti, one of the problems there, I think about 80% of their energy comes from charcoal. So they have very little wood left, and a lot of people getting horrible lung diseases. It is not, you want to come up with something else. So mankind moved along. Coal is somewhat more efficient. You're not chopping down the forest. You can use wood for furniture or building a house or something else. Then petroleum, oil, natural gas, fission. That's amazing. Uranium, teeny little bit of fuel gives you a massive amount of energy and very high temperatures, which means that you can take land that might have been considered just waste or unusable. It had nothing there you could use. But once you have super intense energy, very high temperatures, suddenly you are able to melt things. You're able to change the nature of things. When you get to fusion and you get to plasma, super duper duper high temperatures, you can change molecular structure. You could break things down into their original elements. We could have a situation where the garbage dump landfills that are such a problem now become the greatest resource on Earth. I learned at a conference last year of young nuclear scientists and engineers that now one of the biggest growth industries that everyone's fighting over is nuclear waste, because the new reactors can not only reprocess it, but there are many uses for it. So everyone wants to have the nuclear waste. It is not seen as a bad thing. That's what happens when man progresses. That's what happens when the money is only the instrument of credit to allow the economy to grow. And that is why right now, one of the things that we will be campaigning for is the reinstatement of the Glass-Steagall Act, because the first thing we have to do is dry up the speculators, just shut it down. Shut down the money, shut down the speculation, protect people's savings accounts, put that firewall up that protects the banks so you can issue credit and you can grow. And if we don't understand the difference between monetarism and credit, we could find ourselves still, even now, on the trajectory to World War III, which we should avoid. And that's why this is so important. Thank you.
So given our speakers had a lot of fantastic content, which is wonderful, it also means we don't have that much time for discussion. So to make this as efficient as possible, what I'd like to do is actually get a few questions or very brief reflections in the air, and then we'll have the speakers respond to what they've heard. No, that's, and you can use this microphone.
Yeah, when you mentioned that the devaluation of the peso was bad for Mexico in 1971, well, Mexico in particular was 1980. And my view of that was it was bad for the United States too, because when they devalued the peso, the people buying International Harvester tractors from the Melrose Park plant right outside of Chicago had to cancel all their orders, so that plant shut down. So the working class people working at that plant were all laid off, and of course Mexico didn't get the benefit of the tractors. So the only ones who benefited were Wall Street speculators. So anyway, that's a note to Bennett.
What is LaRouche's official stance on who should run nuclear power plants? Would you allow private corporations to run them, or only be operated by nationalized organizations?
All right, thank you. And I'll ask you to pass it on to whoever is asking the next question, which is, anyone else have anything you'd like to ask or reflect on from what you've heard?
I wanted to ask about Bob's presentation on Lexington and Concord. I was wondering about the sort of what was going on in the minds of people, like the major general, I forget his name, but the guy whose house they fought at. Like, who was in the line of command? Who was he responding to? What did he understand? What was his goal? Was he like, okay, we're gonna beat these guys and like that's it? Like they'll be off, and then, you know, obviously that's not what was happening. But yeah, like what was the sense of what they were? What was their short-term goal? I guess. What was their strategy?
Good. And let's do one more if there is another. Okay.
Thank you. This isn't fully formed in my mind, but I saw how, with the quotations you were using from the report on manufacturers, specifically with the idea of the function of economy being to mobilize the minds of the citizenry. Obviously, that's not anything in, you know, the Austrian school of economics. They're not thinking about that. And it seems to me, with mathematical economics, whether you're talking about Marx or these other Austrian schools, you have they have sort of programmatic systems. They have mathematical systems. And then something like Alexander Hamilton's theory of public credit that also seems to be very clearly what you're saying LaRouche was drawing on with the idea of the necessity of space exploration. That to me seems less of an ideology. And so I guess my question is, how do you promulgate an idea which is not an ideology?
Good. Okay, who's up first? I'll take one of them. I mean, on on energy, this makes me think of the principle of just getting that the government is responsible for providing the overall direction and to make sure that things happen. We've had a variety of different ways of making things happen in our country's history. So if we look in the last century or so, Roosevelt financed the New Deal through government organizations. Many of those projects were themselves directly public works. They were administered by government agencies. People were employed by government agencies, and we built the infrastructure that we still benefit from today. Some of his projects worked on federal financing for private companies. The Rural Electrification Agency worked by giving loans to co-ops that a group of farmers in an area, they'd form a co-op, the government would give them a loan to pay for building the power lines out there, which they then buy the electricity from a private company. So it was kind of a mixture of things in that case. And then another one would be the Apollo program of going to the moon. This was definitely a federal program. This was a national intention coming from Kennedy. And who built all of that equipment? It was not mostly NASA employees. This was contractors that were building parts or modules that NASA designed, engineered, and requested. So in terms of the running of power plants, the US generally has regulated monopoly utilities. So power companies are private, they do make a profit, but their rates are regulated by the government, as is their safety and so forth. I don't think that any particular change is needed in that today regarding nuclear plants. So, who's next? Oh, let's get some responses to these wonderful questions.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good question because it was a big problem until Washington came into Massachusetts and actually took command of an actual army, because these were all militia units. That being said, they had been preparing for this for years, and they understood that this was going to be a hot war. And all of the senior guys had worked in larger units in the 7 Years' War, the Indian Wars, etc. And they knew all the other militia and Minuteman commanders of all the different towns. So and that's what really kind of freaked the British out, because once they got together, they were able to highly coordinate, but there was no commanding officer. Their agenda was, these people are going to be driven back to Boston, i.e. the Redcoats. So that was what they were going to do. And they were able to coordinate very efficiently without a commanding general per se. That came within a month and a half. So, and once Washington got there, it came together very rapidly. So.
Thanks. Anyone want to take up Robert's question? Okay.
Okay. It's an interesting question, but I think this is why Lynn's, because you say, well, the objects of the human mind, how do you measure that? I mean, not with your senses, right? Well, an idea, well, I don't know, it smells like old cheese, right? There's not an idea. So Lynn's idea of the empirical measure of potential population density, I think it allows you to get a shadow. And also the reason why he says potential relative is it's not the number of people that we have now. It's the potential that you could have with that particular platform of infrastructure. But I think we have to give people a metric because people frankly don't have a very scientific way of thinking about things, right? I mean, we hear it from President Trump. Well, yeah, we make, if everyone has to spend $1 million to get a cell phone from China, then we're going to make them here. Okay, great. Where is the factory going to go? They're building this chip plant in Syracuse that has no, well, when we were there, people told us any industry needs a massive amount of water. There was no plan to build a water main to bring the water to the plant, no plan to increase the electricity, and no plan to build a hospital. So part of this ideas that are not ideologies, you do want to say, well, there is an empirical standard which you can sort of calculate by looking at these things. But a lot of them are thought experiments also, which is interesting. Einstein's experiments with the speed of light. He didn't have a train that went at the speed of light that he could measure things, but he was able in his mind to construct an experiment which helped him to actually discover a scientific principle, which is really kind of amazing. It's really provocative, frankly, it's really provocative. But that's Socrates, Plato. How do you know whether something's right or wrong? And how do you organize people on that? And that, I think, is also why Lynn used the phrase, the power of reason. What is our power? Our power is the reason of the people we're speaking with, that we know we have faith that people actually do have within them a knowledge of what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. And we have to seek to bring that out, because many people now have been so degraded that they themselves are not conscious of what's in them. They've silenced those voices. And I think we have to let people hear that conscience again.
I wouldn't add too much more to what Diane said, although I have been kind of struggling with this concept of like the majority versus what makes something a right idea. We've been reading a lot of Edgar Poe in the Bronx, right? And one of the main critiques that Poe has of people and ideas is in the Purloined Letter, where he quotes a French phrase which translates to, the belief that an idea is good because the highest number of people think it's good is wrong. Or put in another way, just because the majority believes something, and therefore if the majority believes something is right, then therefore that makes it true, is idiotic. And one more spin on that is, if an idea appeals to the majority, then there's something wrong with it. But then it's like, I want these ideas to appeal to everyone. There's a sort of paradox in that. Like, everything that everyone went through here, I know everyone in the country has the ability to understand it if they just put in a little bit of concentration and effort to do so. And just on your empiricism and way of measuring progress, and I did a study about this. I wrote about this in your paper, in the New Federalist, about working with Adams, kind of when he first became mayor, and there was a house that exploded right next to where I was living at the time. And he had commissioned I went up to him and I said, this is a pattern and a trend of fires that are happening in the Bronx. The Bronx is still burning. And he said to me, well, Richie Torres has this project to put smart thermometers in houses so that if it gets too cold, we'll know. Oh. And it was supposed to use AI. And I said, no, we need human intelligence. So I put together a report. The population of New York City has stayed pretty much stagnant since the 1970s. But you know what population has gone up? The rat population, So maybe we should measure the potential relative population density of the rats. But you look at a city like some of us know this, that, like Chengdu in China is the 4th largest populated city in China. It's got 20 million people there. And it's much cleaner and more controlled than New York City. It is completely possible to build a much more populated city that is prosperous, where people are getting educated, and the idea of poverty, is just, again, studied. in textbooks, and that there are serious efforts to get rid of poverty. And it all begins with a will to say, yeah, we need to move past whatever New York City is now. So that's my plan, to blow up the Bronx and rebuild it.
Okay, thank you. Well, my take on this thought about popular opinion, and because, Jose, your question's a good one. You want good opinions to be popular. Now, LaRouche said if something is popularly believed, it's probably wrong. And except for the most basic, facts of daily life, that's pretty much true. On any important topic, popular opinion is almost always wrong right now in the United States. Does that mean that we need to only use unpopular opinions forever? No. Right now, the right things are unpopular, or they're not popular. But what you change is the populace. Who are the people that are having these popular opinions? How do people come to reach their judgments? How do they decide what they think about something? I mean, that itself is what has to be transformed in a real cultural renaissance, so that people have a better understanding of how do you come to know something. And this is regrettably not the focus of schools, which, facts, figures, repeating things, maybe they're right, maybe they're not. But the most important thing is what's not being given to those students, where those formulas came from in the physics class, where that thing you learned in geometry, how was that first ever demonstrated, and so forth. I can't resist making a comment on the tariffs too, since this came up. I mean, if you were trying to do the worst job imaginable at setting tariffs, it's kind of what we've got right now. You set them incredibly high based on a measure I won't get into, but it's really irrelevant to anything regarding national industry. So Trump sets these crazy tariff rates, and then they're gone. So, who is setting up a factory which takes years? Who's recruiting a workforce and training them in the processes to be used there, which takes at least months? Who's setting up the contracts to buy the supplies for the factory, which themselves might have varying tariffs from year to year? Who is going to do that if you don't know that things are actually going to be stable? No one. So it's a big flop. Another funny thing about it is that right now with China, it's almost the opposite of what you would want if you were trying to use tariffs well. If you're setting up a factory in the US and you want to buy some equipment from China, some machinery, big tariff. You want to buy some raw materials, big tariff. You want to buy an iPhone? Oh, no, low tariff. So if you're trying to produce high-tech things, high-value things in the US, your raw materials are very expensive, and the product that you might be selling is the kind of thing that doesn't have a tariff. So it's very, very wacky. I mean, by country instead of by product category. Okay, so I think, can we do some, I don't know how we're at the room timing. Would you like to say more about that? Okay.
Before we end the live stream, I just wanted to announce, it's just coming across that Putin proposed an Easter truce of 30 hours, and Zelensky, who's not as trustworthy, I'll put it that way, said that they would like to extend it and double it, and they're going to do this. So I don't know where this is going. I think it's of great interest because we do know there are some people who actually think we should avoid war. So that is a very hopefully positive development and a shift going into the weekend. It's just breaking. Yeah.
So that will conclude our stream for today. I want to say, if you're watching this online and there was a lot of material presented. If you have questions, leave them in the comments. We'll get those to the speakers, and that could help provide the material for further discussions to get back to you with what you're wondering. So thank you, and let's discuss.